The letters my grandmother left in the old piano bench. And I still remember the exact moment the hinged wooden lid gave way under my palm, releasing a cascade of heavy, cream-colored envelopes tied with faded blue velvet ribbon. My name is Jonah Miller, and like my father and grandfather before me, I grew up thinking our family's place in Ashwood, Pennsylvania, was as sturdy and unmovable as the cast-iron frames of the upright pianos my grandfather restored in his downtown shop for over 50 years. After spending the last decade in Philadelphia chasing a corporate architecture career that left me staring at blueprints of glass towers while my personal life unraveled into a quiet divorce, I had returned home following my grandfather's peaceful passing at 88. I expected a solemn weekend of clearing out dust, tuning old instruments, and handing over the brick storefront to the local historical society. I didn't expect to find a hidden bottom compartment beneath the velvet-lined storage seat of his favorite mahogany piano, a space that held not sheet music, but letters written in a trembling, unfamiliar hand, addressed to a man who was never my grandfather, bearing a postmark from a small town in upstate New York dated just 3 weeks before my parents were married. The autumn rain was drumming a steady, melancholic rhythm against the stained glass windows of the workshop when I carefully untied the velvet ribbon, broke the seal of the top envelope, and began to read words that would quietly dismantle every single truth I thought I knew about the Miller bloodline. I sat down heavily on the piano bench, the worn leather groaning beneath my weight as the damp chill of the Ashwood autumn wrapped around my shoulders. The workshop was filled with a familiar, comforting ghost of my childhood, the sharp scent of beeswax, old varnish, seasoned maple, and the dry, metallic tang of piano strings. For as long as I could remember, Arthur Miller had been the bedrock of our family and our town. He was a man of few words, whose hands were permanently stained with dark walnut wood stain and scarred from decades of working with heavy tension levers and hammers. He had raised me after my mother passed away when I was 6, teaching me how to play a piece of oak and how to listen for the subtle, beating dissonance of an untuned string. To me, he was infallible. But the letter I now held in my hand, dated October 14th, 1989, painted a very different portrait of the man I thought I knew. Dearest Arthur, the letter began, written in a flowing, elegant script that belonged neither to my grandfather nor to the grandmother I barely remembered. If Robert finds these letters, everything we build on this lie will collapse. He loves her as his own, but he has a right to know the truth before he stands at the altar. I am terrified of what he will do if he discovers that the child he's raising isn't carrying his blood, but yours. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Robert Miller, the man I called grandfather, wasn't my biological grandfather. And my father, who had died in a logging accident when I was a teenager, hadn't been Robert's son at all. He belonged to Arthur. I stared down at the signature at the bottom of the page. Clara. Before I could process the shock, a sharp, heavy knock rattled the frosted glass front door of the workshop, followed by the familiar squeak of the brass hinges as someone stepped inside out of rain. Jonah, are you in there, son? It was Thomas Henderson, Jr., the local bank president, holding a bulky manila folder under his arm, his tailored coat soaked at the shoulders from the storm. I shoved the letters back into the hidden compartment of the piano bench, slammed the hinge lid down with sharp thud, and stood up just as Thomas Henderson walked out from behind the towering wooden panels of the workshop's inner showroom. The bank president looked entirely out of place among the dust-covered uprights, sanding blocks, and coils of copper wire. Yet he carried himself with the absolute, unearned confidence of a man who believed he owned every square foot of downtown Ashwood. Jonah, Henderson said smoothly, offering a tight, polite smile as he shook the rainwater off his umbrella and propped it against the counter. I saw your car parked out front. Thought I'd drop by before heading over to the bank. I know you're still processing your grandfather's passing, but municipal probate doesn't wait for grief. I forced my hands deep into the pockets of my jeans to keep them from trembling, keeping my body positioned squarely in front of the mahogany piano bench. Probate, Thomas? I asked, my voice carrying a cold edge that made the banker pause. The shop has been in the Miller family for over 50 years. My grandfather left clear instructions. Clear instructions on paper, perhaps, Henderson replied, stepping closer, laying his manila folder down on the workbench with a sharp slap. But properties like this commercial block on Main Street are tied up in old municipal land trusts dating back to the 1970s. Your grandfather took out a significant line of credit against this building 2 years ago to cover back taxes and medical bills. The bank holds a note, Jonah, and as of midnight yesterday, that note is in default. My mind raced. Robert Miller, the man I knew as my stoic, honest grandfather, had taken out a secret loan against the only home and livelihood he had left. It didn't fit. Robert was meticulously frugal, a man who would rather patch his own boots 3 times than buy a new pair, unless the debt wasn't his, unless the financial pressure came from the very secret buried in the letters I had just found inside the piano bench. The bank holds a default note, I repeated slowly, narrowing my eyes at him. Convenient timing, Thomas. Right after his funeral. Exactly how much are we talking about? Henderson's polite corporate smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a fleeting flicker of irritation crossing his face before he smoothed it back into professional sympathy. $42,000, Henderson said smoothly. Of course, given our long history with the Miller family, the bank is willing to waive immediate foreclosure proceedings. If you agree to sign over the historical deed and the structural rights to the adjacent empty lot behind the shop, the town council wants to expand the municipal parking deck, and your grandfather's property is the last piece of the puzzle. I stared at him, the pieces of a very ugly puzzle suddenly clicking together in my mind. The sudden debt, the mysterious letters from Clara, the bank's aggressive push for downtown expansion. It wasn't just about parking spaces. I'm not signing anything today, Thomas, I said, my voice dropping into a flat, unyielding register. Come back when the shop isn't still smelling of my grandfather's cologne. Henderson's eyes hardened into cold steel. He picked up his manila folder, tucked it securely under his arm, and turned toward the door. Take all the time you need, Jonah, Henderson said, his voice dropping an octave as he reached the handle. Just remember that historical brick storefronts are fragile things. Sometimes a stiff wind or a sudden zoning reclassification can bring a whole legacy crashing down overnight. The front door slammed shut behind him, leaving me alone in the quiet workshop with the rain drumming against the roof and a secret box of letters burning a hole in the piano bench behind me. The heavy mahogany door rattled in its frame as Henderson's footsteps faded away down the wet wooden sidewalk of Main Street. The workshop fell back into a profound, suffocating silence, broken only by the steady, rhythmic drip of a leaky gutter outside. I turned back to the piano bench, my hand shaking as I lifted the wooden lid once more and pulled out the rest of the cream-colored envelopes. There were 6 in total, tied with that faded blue velvet ribbon. I laid them out across the scarred workbench, right beside Henderson's manila folder. I picked up the second letter, dated November 3rd, 1989, just 2 weeks after first. Robert is suspecting nothing, Clara's elegant cursive read. He spends 12 hours a day in the shop, pouring his heart into restoring those old instruments, believing the child I'm carrying is his legacy. But every time he looks at me with those kind, trusting eyes, I feel like a thief. Arthur, we cannot keep meeting at the cabin by the reservoir. If Robert finds out you are his brother, and that the child belongs to you, it will destroy this family completely. Ashwood is too small a town to hide a betrayal this heavy. My vision blurred. The room spun slightly. Brothers. Robert and Arthur Miller weren't just business partners or distant kin. They were brothers. And the man I called grandfather, Robert, had raised his brother's child as his own, carrying a silent, agonizing heartbreak to his grave, or perhaps knowing all along and choosing to bury the secret beneath a lifetime of sawdust and tuned strings. And my father, the man killed in the logging accident, wasn't Robert's son. He was Arthur's, which meant Arthur, the man who had raised me, taught me how to work wood, and wept at my mother's funeral, wasn't just my grandfather figure. He was my biological grandfather. I picked up the final letter in the bundle. It was dated January 12th, 1990, written just days before my birth. Robert signed the birth certificate today without a single question asked. He told me it doesn't matter who seed planted the tree, as long as we're the ones who water it. But he made me promise one thing, Arthur, that we would take this secret to our graves, and that you would leave Ashwood forever, so the boy would never know the shadow of our sin. I'm sorry, my love, but Robert is the true father here. May God forgive us all. I dropped the letter onto the workbench. The paper drifted down softly, landing beside a set of tuning wrenches my grandfather had used just weeks before he died. Robert knew. He had known everything from the very beginning. He had swallowed his pride, protected his brother's honor, loved a woman who carried another man's child, and raised me with a fierce, unconditional tenderness that I had never questioned. And now, Thomas Henderson, the son of the man who had tried to bankrupt Robert's shop 40 years ago, was trying to use a fraudulent $42,000 debt to steal the building right out from under the family that had bled for it. I reached for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found a name I hadn't dialed in years. Sarah Gable, the county records attorney and Brenda's niece, who had spent the last 5 years auditing municipal land grabs downtown. "Sarah," I said the moment she picked up, my voice hard and resolute, "I need you to pull every financial ledger on the Miller piano shop from 1989 to the present. I think Thomas Henderson's father didn't just buy a mortgage note. He forged it." "Forged?" Sarah's voice crackled over the phone speaker, sharp with sudden professional skepticism. "Jonah, that's a heavy accusation. The Ashwood Savings and Trust has kept their records ironclad for decades. If Thomas Henderson claims there's a $42,000 lien against your grandfather's shop, the county clerk's office usually takes it as gospel. Humor me, Sarah," I urged, keeping my eyes fixed on the cream-colored envelopes spread across the workbench. My grandfather was the most meticulous man in this county. He logged every nickel he spent on shellac, piano wire, and hammerfelt in ledger books that go back 50 years. He wouldn't take out a secret 5-figure loan 2 years ago without writing down every single reason why, unless someone else put his name on that dotted line. A pause stretched over the line, filled only by the muffled sound of shuffling papers and typing from her office at the county annex. "All right," Sarah sighed. "Give me 20 minutes. I'll pull the original deed of trust filed in the registry and cross-reference Robert's signature with the county tax cards from that quarter. But Jonah, if this turns out to be a legitimate debt, the bank can foreclose in less than 10 days. You need to be prepared for that." "I'm prepared," I said, though my stomach was tied in knots. "Call me the second you find something." I hung up, tossing my phone onto the workbench beside Clara's letters. The workshop felt smaller now, the shadows stretching longer as the afternoon storm darkened the sky outside. I walked over to the tall, glass-fronted filing cabinet where Robert had stored his personal ledgers, the sacred texts of his trade and life. I unlocked the glass door with a small brass key I found hanging on a nail behind the calendar. Row after row of black-bound composition books sat neatly on the shelves, labeled by year in Robert's precise, angular hand. I scanned the rows: 1995, 2000, 2005, 2015, 2020. My hand swept across the shelf until I reached the back corner, behind a stack of old piano roll boxes. There sat a slim, dusty ledger marked simply with a date range, 1988 to 1992, the exact years of Clara's letters, the years of the grand deception. I pulled the book free, a cloud of dry dust rising into the air, and carried it back to the workbench. I opened it to October 1989. The pages were filled with standard entries about upright repairs, tuning fees, and strings ordered from a supplier in Pittsburgh. But as I flipped ahead to the exact date of Clara's first letter, October 14th, 1989, my breath hitched. The handwriting on the ledger page wasn't Robert's. It was Arthur's. The jagged, hurried script broke the immaculate rhythm of the book. Robert agreed to the terms today. The child will carry his name. I am leaving for the rail yard in Altoona before dawn. May God have mercy on us. Before I could digest the full implications of the entry, my phone buzzed violently on the wood. It was Sarah. "Jonah," she said, her voice dropping to a breathless whisper. "You were right. I pulled the 1989 trust document Henderson used to file the default. It's a fake. The signature on the loan agreement isn't even Robert's handwriting. It's a tracing. And worse, the notary who supposedly witnessed, it was Thomas Henderson Sr. back when he was a junior loan officer. A 40-year long game," I whispered, the room spinning. "They tried to steal the block back then, and when Robert and Arthur outsmarted them by adopting the child under Robert's name, Henderson's son waited until they were both gone to finish the job. "Jonah, listen to me," Sarah warned urgently. "Henderson just filed an emergency motion at the municipal court an hour ago. Judge Holloway signed an expedited writ of possession. They're bringing the county sheriff to evict you and seize the property by 3 o'clock this afternoon." 3 o'clock? I looked at the old brass wall clock hanging beside the calendar. The hands were already creeping past 2:15. "Sarah, that's less than 40 minutes. They can't execute an eviction without a formal 10-day notice of default hearings. Normally, no." Sarah's voice trembled over the line. But Henderson invoked an emergency municipal blight clause, claiming the building's structural integrity poses a hazard to Main Street traffic. Judge Holloway rubber-stamped it without reading the docket. "Jonah, they're moving fast because they know what's buried in the basement archives." "Basement archives?" I frowned, my eyes darting toward the heavy wooden door in the corner of the workshop that led down into the subterranean timber storage cellar, a place Robert and Arthur had strictly forbidden me from entering as a boy. "What's in the basement, Sarah?" "The original 1950 Municipal Water Board survey," she said quickly. "The one that proves the Ashwood Savings and Trust illegally acquired downtown commercial blocks during the Depression using forged mortgage notes. Henderson's father hid it down there when the bank was audited in the 70s, thinking Robert wouldn't notice. But Robert found it and used it as leverage to keep Henderson's family from foreclosing on the shop 40 years ago. That ledger is the only thing protecting this building." The pieces violently snapped together. The $42,000 debt wasn't real. The default notice was a smoke screen. Henderson didn't want a parking deck. He wanted to bulldoze the workshop to permanently bury the evidence of his family's generational fraud. "I'm going down there," I said, my voice hardening. "Jonah, don't. If the sheriff's deputies catch you breaking into the municipal seal on that archive room, they'll arrest you on the spot." "Let them try," I said, and disconnected the call. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed Clara's letters, shoved them into my jacket pocket alongside Robert's 1988 to 1992 ledger, and sprinted across the workshop floor. I threw open the heavy cellar door, revealing a steep, unlit flight of wooden stairs plunging down into the damp, earth-scented dark. I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight off the workbench, clicked it on, and plunged down the stairs. The beam cut through thick clouds of dust, illuminating towering stacks of seasoned maple, old piano frames, and cobweb-laced rafters. At the far end of the cellar stood a heavy iron door, the kind salvaged from a bank vault, with a mechanical combination lock that had rusted shut decades ago. But right beside it, set into the stone foundation wall, was a loose wooden panel camouflaged to look like standard wainscoting. I dropped to my knees, clawing at the dust and spiderwebs, and pushed against the panel. It gave way with a muffled pop, swinging inward to reveal a small, dry concrete cavity lit by a single, hanging incandescent bulb wired into an old extension cord. Inside sat a heavy, fireproof metal box and an open wooden crate filled with municipal survey maps, stamped with red ink. Ashwood Water Board, classified. I reached inside, my fingers wrapping around the metal box just as a loud, heavy pounding echoed from upstairs through the floorboards. "Sheriff's Department. Open up the front door. By order of the municipal court, this property is hereby seized." The front glass of the workshop shattered with a sharp, explosive crash. They weren't waiting for 3 o'clock. Henderson's raid had arrived early. The sharp, echoing crash of breaking glass upstairs vibrated straight down to the floor joists of the cellar, showering a fine layer of dust over my shoulders. "Mr. Miller, you're in violation of a municipal seizure order. Come out with your hands where we can see them." A harsh, amplified voice boomed from the workshop floor above, bouncing off the timberline walls and rolling down the cellar stairs. I didn't answer. I pulled the heavy, fireproof metal box entirely out from the concealed concrete cavity, setting it down on the damp earth beside the open crate of classified municipal survey maps. My fingers were steady, driven by a cold, sharp clarity that left no room for panic. This wasn't just about saving a building anymore. It was about honoring the quiet, agonizing sacrifices of two men, Robert and Arthur, who had spent a lifetime protecting a family and a truth that the Hendersons were willing to commit perjury to bury. I flipped the heavy brass latches of the metal box. Inside, Resting on top of a stack of legal affidavits from 1950 was a thick leather-bound volume marked with gold lettering. Master Land Trust Ledger, Ashwood Municipal. I grabbed the ledger, tucked it firmly under my arm along with the survey maps, and grabbed the metal box with my free hand. As I turned toward the cellar stairs, heavy boots began to stamp their way down the wooden steps. They were groaning loudly under the weight of at least 2 men. Check the lower level. Henderson said he's hiding in the back. A deputy's voice barked from the top of the stairs, accompanied by the harsh, sweeping beam of a tactical flashlight slicing through the dust-moted dark. There was no time to climb back up. The stairs were the only exit. I spun around, scanning the dim, crowded perimeter of the subterranean timber storage. In the far corner, half hidden behind an upright piano frame stripped of its iron plate, was a small, rusted coal chute that opened upward into the alley behind Main Street. The beam of the flashlight swept across the lower landing, locking onto my jacket as I bolted toward the back of the cellar. "Hey, stop right there. Drop what you're holding," the deputy yelled, his heavy boots pounding down the remaining steps as he charged across the dirt floor. I didn't stop. I threw the metal box through the narrow, iron-grated coal chute, hearing it clatter against the gravel of the alley outside. Then, grabbing the overhead timber beam, I hoisted myself up, shoved the rusted iron grate outward with my shoulder, and scrambled head-first out into the cool, rain-slicked air of Main Street just as a pair of hands grabbed the hem of my jacket back in the dark. I wrenched myself forward, tearing the fabric, and spilled out onto the wet asphalt, clutching the master ledger and the survey maps against my chest like a shield. The cold autumn rain hit my face like buckshot as I scrambled to my feet in the narrow, trash-strewn alley behind Main Street. Behind me, the iron grate of the coal chute clattered open, and a deputy's voice shouted curses into the open air, though he didn't follow me out into the public lane. Clutching the master ledger and the classified survey maps against my chest with one arm, I sprinted down the alleyway, my boots splashing through deep puddles, heading straight toward the county courthouse just 2 blocks away. The storm overhead was breaking into a full-scale downpour, turning Main Street into a shimmering mirror of gray light and neon signs. As I rounded the corner toward the grand limestone steps of the municipal building, I saw a crowd gathering near the front entrance. At the center of the commotion was Thomas Henderson, Jr., standing beneath the grand portico, holding an eviction notice in one hand while directing 2 county sheriff's deputies toward the piano shop across the street. Next to him stood Judge Holloway, holding a black umbrella, looking thoroughly annoyed at being dragged out into the rain. "Move quickly and clear the building," Henderson was instructing the deputies, his voice carrying clearly over the hiss of the rain. "The structural seizure is absolute. Anything inside becomes municipal property by sundown." "It's not municipal property, Thomas," I called out, my voice cutting through the wet wind as I stepped out from the shelter of a brick arcade, walking straight up the limestone steps toward the portico. Henderson whipped his head around, his eyes widening in pure shock as he saw me standing there drenched, mud-splattered, and holding the heavy leather-bound ledger and the stamped waterboard maps. "Arrest him," Henderson shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. He just broke into a sealed commercial property and stole municipal documents. "Actually, Thomas, I just recovered stolen property," I said, stepping right up to Judge Holloway, ignoring the 2 deputies who lunged forward and grabbed my arms. "Your Honor, before you enforce that seizure order, you might want to look at what was hidden beneath the Miller piano shop for 40 years. Judge Holloway frowned, holding his umbrella higher as he peered down at the heavy ledger in my hands. "Mr. Miller, you are in contempt of an emergency judicial writ." "Read the signature on page 212, Your Honor," I interrupted, my voice dropping into an unshakable, commanding register. "And check the notary stamp." It was signed by Thomas Henderson Sr. in 1951, proving that the Ashwood Savings and Trust illegally acquired half the commercial district using fraudulent mortgage seizures. The exact same fraud your bank is trying to pull today to cover it up. Henderson lunged forward, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "It's a fabrication. A desperate stunt by a bankrupt woodworker." "Is it?" A sharp, clear voice echoed from the bottom of the limestone steps. We all turned, walking up through the rain, holding a massive stack of official state audit files, with Sarah Gable, flanked by two men in dark trench coats wearing state attorney general badges. The State Financial Oversight Board has been reviewing the 1950 municipal water board transfers since this morning, Sarah announced, stepping onto the portico and handing an open file directly to Judge Holloway. The bank's emergency blight claim is legally void, and the $42,000 debt against the Miller shop, it was forged by Thomas Henderson Sr. 40 years ago and renewed by his son this morning to force a demolition. Judge Holloway looked down at the state seal on the audit file, then at the master ledger in my hands, and finally at Thomas Henderson Jr., whose corporate composure had completely evaporated, leaving him staring dumbly at the rain-slicked pavement. The judge slowly closed his umbrella, his expression turning grim. He looked at the two deputies holding my arms. "Let him go," Holloway ordered quietly. He turned his gaze to Henderson. "Mr. Henderson, step into my chambers. It appears we have a very long afternoon ahead of us." The courtyard fell utterly silent, save for the steady patter of the rain, washing clean the steps of Ashwood. 3 weeks later, the autumn storm had given way to a crisp, clear November morning. The Myler Piano Shop on Main Street was bustling with life again. Local volunteers had helped repair the glass storefront, and the warm, resonant notes of a newly tuned mahogany grand piano drifted out onto the sidewalk, mingling with the chatter of passers-by. I stood in the center of the workshop, running my hand along the smooth, polished grain of the piano bench where I had first found Clara's letters. The legal battles were over. The bank was under state receivership. The fraudulent liens had been permanently erased, and the block belonged entirely to the family that had built it with sawdust, patience, and love. My phone buzzed on the workbench. It was a text message from Arthur, who was back home in his old armchair, healing slowly after a brief hospital stay, watching old woodworking videos on a battered tablet. "The piano sounds good from down the street, Jonah." The message read, "Your grandfather would be proud, and so is your father." I smiled, looking up at the framed black and white photograph of Robert and Arthur standing side by side in this very workshop back in 1972, their arms slung over each other's shoulders, sharing a secret the world had tried desperately to silence. I picked up a tuning hammer, walked over to an old upright in the corner, and struck a key. The strings sang out clear, true, and resonant into the morning air.